Marcus thought he knew what darkness looked like until that December night in 2005, when he learned that some shadows have teeth and hunger for more than just light. The Ocean View Motel sat on Atlantic City's decaying boardwalk like a festering wound against the winter sky, its blood-red neon sign flickering vacancy, in a rhythm that reminded Marcus of a dying heartbeat every time he walked through those glass doors to start another graveyard shift. 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 5 nights a week, just him and whatever demons crawled out of the woodwork when decent people were safe in their beds, dreaming dreams that didn't reek of desperation and cheap disinfectant. During the summer months, the place almost felt normal, with families checking in for weekend getaways, kids splashing in the chlorine-scented pool while their parents sipped cocktails and watched the sunset paint the ocean in shades of gold and crimson. But winter was a completely different beast that transformed the motel into something that felt more like a purgatory than a place of rest, where management slashed their rates to $27 a week just to keep warm bodies in the rooms and the lights on in a building that seemed to absorb hope and exhale misery. They advertised to snowbirds, those sweet elderly folks from places like Minnesota and Wisconsin who came south to escape the brutal cold. But cheap rooms are like blood in shark-infested waters, attracting every predator, parasite, and lost soul within a 50-mile radius. Drug dealers with eyes like black holes set up shop in rooms that reeked of chemicals and broken dreams, while addicts whose veins had collapsed years ago wandered the halls like walking corpses, scratching at invisible bugs and mumbling conversations with ghosts that only they could see. Marcus had seen it all during his 2 years working the night shift. From the woman in room 114 who screamed bloody murder at exactly 3:17 every morning though no one ever answered her cries, to the bloodstains on the carpet in room 203 that housekeeping had given up trying to scrub away because they just kept reappearing like some kind of macabre Rorschach test. The smell of methamphetamine cooking in room 237 had become as familiar as his morning coffee, and he'd lost count of how many times he'd had to call 911 for overdoses, domestic violence situations, or just to have someone remove a body that had been rotting behind a locked door for God knows how long. That particular night started like any other, with Marcus counting the pathetic $43 and some loose change in the register, while Sarah from the evening shift grabbed her coat and practically sprinted toward the parking lot, her eyes darting around like she expected something to jump out of the shadows and drag her back into that fluorescent-lit tomb they called a lobby. The silence that followed her departure was the kind of heavy, oppressive quiet that makes your skin crawl and your ears ring, broken only by the dying buzz of lights that made everyone look like they were suffering from some terminal illness. Tommy Rivera showed up about 10 minutes later, just like he did every night. This maintenance guy who'd somehow become Marcus's closest friend and maybe the only person left in the world who still looked him in the eye like he was human instead of just another piece of furniture in this house of horrors. Tommy worked the evening shift at all 3 motels owned by their company, and every night around 11:30, he'd swing by to grab them both dinner from Mel's all-night diner, then hang around for an hour or two to keep Marcus company during those dead hours when time moved like thick syrup and every shadow seemed to whisper promises of violence. "The usual tonight, brother?" Tommy asked, his voice echoing off the cracked walls of the lobby while his breath formed little clouds in the over-air-conditioned space that management kept cold enough to preserve meat, probably because they were too cheap to fix the ancient heating system that had been broken since Marcus started working there. Marcus nodded and headed toward the back office to dig his wallet out from under the mountain of repair requests and noise complaints that would never be addressed, walking past the yellowed motivational posters that someone had hung years ago in a pathetic attempt to make the place seem less like a monument to human failure. He was still rummaging through the papers on his desk, feeling around for his wallet between invoices for repairs that would never happen and incident reports that no one would ever read, when he heard the door chime ring with that particular metallic sound that always made his skin crawl because it meant another lost soul was stumbling into their little corner of hell. But this time something was different about the sound, something that hung in the air like a death rattle and made every hair on the back of his neck stand up straight, because it was too late for legitimate guests and too early for the morning crowd. And Marcus had learned to trust his instincts about these things after 2 years of dealing with people who had nothing left to lose. By the time he walked back into the front office, still clutching his wallet, and expecting to see Tommy chatting with whoever had just walked in. The first thing he noticed was his friend lying face down on that sticky linoleum floor with his arms splayed out like he'd been dropped from a great height. Marcus's eyes traveled upward in slow motion, taking in the sight of a man who looked like death himself had decided to take human form for the evening. All sharp angles and stretched skin with eyes that weren't just empty, but actually seemed to be sucking light out of the room around them. The steel pipe in the man's right hand caught the sickly fluorescent light, and Marcus could see dark stains crusted along its length that he instinctively knew was old blood from previous encounters, previous victims who had found themselves in exactly the same position he was in right now. Time seemed to slow down to a crawl as Marcus opened his mouth to scream or ask what was happening or maybe just to breathe, but before any sound could escape, that pipe connected with his jaw like a sledgehammer hitting glass, and the sound of his own bones breaking echoed through the lobby, while warm copper flooded his mouth in a taste that he would never be able to forget. The impact sent him crashing to one knee as the world tilted sideways like a ship taking on water, and through the ringing in his ears that sounded like a fire alarm going off inside his skull, he could hear the man talking to someone else in a voice like sandpaper scraping against concrete, saying something about Tommy getting away and how they should have grabbed him first. The pipe came down again, this time across the back of Marcus's head with enough force to make the fluorescent lights above seem to pulse and dim, like the motel itself was losing consciousness right along with him. And he felt himself falling through layers of pain and confusion while colors bled together like watercolors in the rain. What happened next existed in fragments that his brain could never quite piece together into a coherent memory, just snapshots of agony and terror that would replay in his nightmares for years to come. He remembered the taste of pennies and fear coating his tongue, the feeling of warm liquid pooling beneath his cheek on that grimy floor, and the sound of footsteps running away into the night, like whatever had attacked him was never really there at all. Somehow, Marcus managed to crawl across the lobby to the office phone, his hands shaking so violently that he could barely grip the receiver while blood dripped steadily from his scalp onto the guest registration book, each drop spreading like tiny crimson flowers across pages filled with fake names and addresses that would never check out. When the 911 operator answered, the words that came out of his mouth sounded like liquid mumbles because his jaw was hanging wrong, completely disconnected from the rest of his face, and speaking felt like trying to swallow broken glass while someone was pouring sand down his throat. Hotel, attacked, bleeding, was all he managed to get out before his strength gave up entirely, and he was still slumped against the desk when Tommy walked through the front door with a police officer in tow, both of them alive and whole, and talking in voices that seemed to come from very far away. The story that emerged from Tommy's shaken explanation was almost too bizarre to believe. There had been two attackers, and while one was busy turning Marcus's head into a punching bag, the second man was supposed to neutralize Tommy, but had frozen up completely, just standing there like a robot that had stopped functioning mid-program. At the hospital, they put 13 staples in Marcus's head while a doctor with tired eyes explained that he had suffered a severe concussion and was lucky to be alive, though the word lucky seemed like a cosmic joke given that he was lying on a gurney with his skull held together by metal staples and his jaw wired shut. 3 days later, when Detective Morrison showed him the security footage, Marcus thought he remembered the attack clearly. The surprise, the first devastating blow, maybe one more strike before his attackers fled into the night like the cowards they were. The video told a completely different story that made Marcus question his own sanity and wonder if he had actually died that night and was now living in some kind of purgatorial replay of his final moments. He watched himself get beaten down by that steel pipe, only to somehow struggle back to his feet like a zombie that refused to stay dead, then get beaten down again and rise again, over and over in a grotesque cycle that continued 10 times total while fists and pipe alternated in a rhythm that seemed almost ritualistic. The most disturbing part wasn't the violence itself, but the way his unconscious body kept fighting back, kept trying to grab the pipe away from his attacker, kept trying to stand up for more punishment like something else was controlling his movements, something that absolutely refused to let him die easy or quick. It was like watching a marionette with cut strings still trying to dance, and Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had taken control of his body that night wasn't entirely human. 3 weeks later, Against all medical advice and the pleading of everyone who claimed to care about him, Marcus returned to work at the Ocean View Motel for the same graveyard shift that had nearly killed him, walking back into that fluorescent-lit tomb like a moth drawn to a flame that had already burned its wings off once before. Management offered him daytime hours where the sunlight might chase away whatever demons had taken up residence in his nightmares. But something deep in his bones told him that running away wouldn't solve anything, that whatever had happened that night was far from over. Every time the door chime rang during those long hours between midnight and dawn, he still works the night shift, still counts that pathetic register, still waits for Tommy to bring dinner from Mel's all-night diner. But now he knows the truth that management would never put in their brochures or advertise on their website. The Ocean View Motel doesn't just offer cheap rooms for desperate people. It offers something much more expensive, something that costs pieces of your soul and fragments of your sanity. And the bill for that particular service always comes due at exactly 3:17 a.m. when the woman in room 114 starts screaming and the shadows begin to move with purpose and hunger.